So this is actually a very decent sword.
So is it considered a sword being that short, or is it a knife?
Generally, it's called a dagger. It's
Okay.
Cotanto. It qualifies as a dagger, but it's still a sword in a sense.
Rick Harrison has seen everything. In over 2 decades behind the counter at the gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas, he's handled Egyptian artifacts, Napoleon's letters, sunken treasure coins, and battlefield weapons. He's been surprised, impressed, occasionally stunned. But some moments are different. Electric moments when something walks through the door and the whole room shifts. When even the experts pause before speaking. When the number on the table silences everyone. This is one of those moments. A sword. Not just any sword. A blade so violent, so storied, so deeply woven into human history that no price tag can fully capture it. A weapon that survived centuries of warfare and the erosion of time, and then walked into the gold and silver and forced Rick Harrison to say a number he wasn't prepared for. $1 million. Stay here, because the story of how this sword reached that counter, what it meant, and what happened next is one of the most gripping tales ever told on that shop floor. By the end, you'll never look at antique weapons the same way. The Gold and Silver Pawn Shop. Before we get to the sword, you need to understand the arena. In the Harrison family since 1981, when Rick's father, Richard Benjamin Harrison, known to millions as the Old Man, opened its doors. Over 4 decades, it has transformed from a neighborhood pawn shop into one of the most famous retail establishments in the world. And that transformation happened for one simple reason: the people who walk through that door. Las Vegas is a city of transients, of desperate fortune and sudden luck, of people who arrived with everything and left with nothing, or arrived with nothing and left rich. The pawn shop sits at the intersection of all those stories, and sometimes mixed in with the guitars and the jewelry and the vintage electronics, something extraordinary appears. Rick Harrison built his reputation on being able to tell the difference. He is not just a pawnbroker. He is a historian, a dealer, a negotiator, and, when the moment calls for it, a buyer willing to make a bet that most people would never take. He also knows his limits. And when something arrives that pushes against those limits, when the history is too deep, the provenance too complex, the potential value too significant for one man to assess alone, he calls in experts. The sword we are talking about today pushed every single one of those limits. So let us start at the beginning. Let us talk about what kind of sword could possibly be worth $1 million, and why, when you understand the answer, the number starts to feel almost modest. The history of legendary swords. Most people think of swords as weapons, and they are right, but that framing misses almost everything that makes a truly historic blade valuable. A sword carried by an ordinary soldier in an ordinary battle is worth something, perhaps a few $100s for its age and condition. A sword carried by a general, cleaned, maintained, documented, is worth considerably more. But a sword that was present at a turning point in history, that was carried by a figure whose name still echoes through the centuries, that has a documented chain of ownership stretching back to the moment it was forged, that sword is in a different category entirely. Consider some reference points. A sword believed to have belonged to William Wallace, the Scottish warrior immortalized in Braveheart, is housed in the National Wallace Monument in Stirling, Scotland. Its historical and cultural value is considered essentially incalculable. The sword of Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, and one of Britain's most formidable colonial adversaries, sold at auction in 2010 for £175,000, roughly $220,000 for a single blade. Napoleon Bonaparte's swords have fetched extraordinary sums. A saber carried by Napoleon during his Italian campaign sold at auction in 2007 for nearly $6.5 million, making it one of the most expensive swords ever sold. A sword given by Napoleon to his brother sold for over $2 million. The pattern is clear. When the man behind the blade is historically significant enough, the weapon itself becomes a vessel for that significance. Now you begin to understand the framework. You begin to see how, if the right sword, with the right provenance, the right documentation, the right history, walked into the gold and silver pawn shop, the number $1 million would not be outrageous. It might even be conservative. And that is exactly what happened. The seller walks in. Imagine the ordinary rhythm of a day at the gold and silver. Customers filing in and out. Corey and Chumley at the counter, handling the steady stream of watches, coins, and electronics. Rick somewhere in the back, reviewing inventory or taking a call. And then the door opens. The person carrying the sword does not look like someone who just walked out of a museum. They rarely do on Pawn Stars. Some of the most extraordinary items in the show's history have arrived wrapped in old blankets or stuffed into cardboard boxes, the owner's casual handling of the object inversely proportional to its actual significance. What matters is not the packaging. What matters is what comes out of it. The sword is immediately striking. The blade is long, the kind of length that tells you this was not a ceremonial piece, not something made to hang on a wall. This was made to be used. The metalwork catches the light in a way that speaks to craftsmanship of a different era, when the man who forged the blade understood that the weapon he was creating might one day determine who lived and who died. The hilt, the handle, the guard, the pommel carries markings, engravings, detail work that does not belong on a mass-produced military weapon. This was made for someone specific, someone important. Rick's expression shifts. Not dramatically, he is too experienced for that. But the questions start coming quickly. Where did you get this? How long has it been in your family? Do you have any documentation? Any paperwork? Anything that traces where this blade has been? And then the seller starts to talk. The provenance. In the world of antique weapons, the blade itself is only half the story. The other half, sometimes the more valuable half, is the paper trail. The provenance. The documented history of who owned the sword, when, where, and under what circumstances. Without provenance, an extraordinary sword is worth a significant amount. With provenance, with letters, photographs, military records, or auction documentation connecting the blade to a specific historical figure, the value can multiply tenfold overnight. This is where things get genuinely tense, because the seller has paperwork, and the paperwork tells a story that, if verified, would make this one of the most significant weapons ever to cross Rick Harrison's counter. The document suggests that this sword belonged to, or was directly connected to, a figure from one of the most consequential military periods in Western history. The details are layered. Original ownership records, a chain of private sales through the 19th and early 20th century, correspondence that references the blade specifically, and photographs that show the sword in the hands of people whose names are in the history books. Rick reads through the documents carefully. He handles the blade, he examines the engravings, he turns the hilt over in his hands. And then he does what Rick Harrison always does when the stakes are high enough. He picks up the phone. "I gotta call a buddy of mine," he says. The expert arrives. The expert Rick calls in on significant weapons is typically someone with serious academic credentials, a specialist in military history, antique arms, or the specific historical period in question. These are not casual enthusiasts. These are people who have spent decades studying exactly the kind of object now sitting on the glass counter. The expert arrives and the atmosphere in the shop changes immediately. Chumley takes a step back. Corey watches closely. Rick stands to the side, arms crossed, watching the expert's face the way a poker player watches for tells. The expert puts on gloves, picks up the sword, holds it at different angles in the light, examines the blade with a magnifying loupe, studies the engravings, reads the paperwork, reads it again. The silence stretches out. Nobody speaks. This is the moment that Pawn Stars does better than almost any other show on television. The suspension of judgment, the genuine uncertainty before expertise weighs in. Because here is the thing about antique weapons. The market is flooded with fakes. Not amateur fakes, sophisticated forgeries produced by craftsmen who understood metallurgy, period-accurate engraving techniques, and the specific patina that develops on iron and steel over centuries. Some forgeries have fooled museums. Some have sold at major auction houses before being exposed years later. Which means the expert's job is not simply to admire the sword. It is to interrogate it, to look for anachronisms, to test whether the materials, the construction, the wear patterns, and the engravings are all consistent with the period the documentation claims. The expert sets the sword down, looks at Rick, and begins to speak. The verdict. The sword is real. Not just real in the sense that it is genuinely old, but real in the sense that the provenance holds up. The expert confirms that the blade's metallurgical composition is consistent with the claimed period of manufacture. The engravings show the kind of wear and oxidation that cannot be artificially replicated without detection. The documentation, while not ironclad, it rarely is with objects this old, is consistent, credible, and supports the seller's account. And the historical connection? The expert validates it, carefully with appropriate caveats, but validates it nonetheless. This sword was not made for an ordinary man. The craftsmanship, the materials, the personalized detail work in the hilt, these were expensive even by the standards of the era in which the sword was created. This was a commission, a gift, a statement of status from someone wealthy and important enough to want a blade that reflected their position. And the paper trail suggests exactly who that person was. Rick listens to all of this without expression. Then he asks the question that has been building since the seller first walked through the door. What is it worth? The expert pauses, looks at the sword one more time, looks at the documentation, calculates. Conservatively, the expert says, at auction, with this provenance, this condition, and the right marketing, you are looking at $1 million, possibly more. The number lands in the room like a stone dropped into still water. $1 million, sitting on the counter of a pawn shop in Las Vegas. Rick's dilemma. Here is where Pawn Stars gets genuinely fascinating, and where Rick Harrison earns his reputation as one of the most skilled negotiators on television. Because $1 million appraisal does not mean $1 million offer. Rick Harrison is not a museum. He is not an auction house. He is a businessman who buys items, holds them in inventory, and sells them at a profit. That process takes time, effort, marketing, and risk. The difference between what something is worth and what Rick can offer for it is always significant. But this is also not a $10 pocket watch. This is a sword with a 7-figure appraisal. And Rick knows, sitting with that number, that the seller knows it too. The seller has done their homework. They came into that shop with documentation. They came in knowing, or strongly suspecting, what they had. This is not someone who stumbled in off the street with a family heirloom they assumed was decorative. This is someone who understood the value of their asset and came to test the market. So now the dance begins. Rick starts by acknowledging the expert's appraisal. He compliments the sword. He validates the provenance. And then he does what Rick always does. He reframes the conversation around his reality as a buyer, not the seller's reality as an owner. I love it, Rick says. But here is the thing. I have to find the right buyer for something like this. That is not easy. It could sit in my shop for 2 years before the right person walks through that door. I have got money tied up. I have got overhead. I take all the risk. That has to be reflected in what I can offer. The seller listens. They are not moved. The expert said $1 million, the seller replies. I know what I have. And now, the real negotiation begins. The art of the deal. There is a reason Rick Harrison has become one of the most recognizable faces in the world of antiques and collectibles. It is not just the television show. It is not just the Las Vegas location. It is the combination of encyclopedic knowledge, genuine passion for history, and ruthlessly clear-eyed business sense that he brings to every transaction. Most people who walk into a pawn shop are in some form of financial distress. They need money now. The object they are selling is a means to an end. Rick understands this dynamic and uses it, not cruelly, but efficiently. But the seller with the sword is different. This person is not desperate. They have options. They could take this sword to Christie's or Sotheby's. They could list it with a specialist military antiques dealer. They could be patient, market it properly, and potentially realize that full $1 million appraisal over time. Rick knows this, and it forces him to operate differently than he does with the typical walk-in. So he does something rare for Rick Harrison in high-stakes negotiations. He gets genuinely excited about the history. He talks about the sword's significance. He references the historical period, the figures involved, the way this blade connects to events that shaped the modern world. He is not performing. This is the part of his job Rick genuinely loves. And then, from that place of shared enthusiasm, he makes his offer. It is not $1 million. It is never $1 million. But it is a number that reflects the seriousness of what is sitting between them. A number that says, I understand what you have, I respect what you have, and I want it badly enough to put real money on the table right now. The question is, will the seller take it? The counter offer. This is the moment Pawn Stars fans live for. The moment after Rick makes his offer and the camera holds on the seller's face. The flicker of calculation, the barely suppressed reaction, the pause that stretches just long enough to make everyone watching lean forward. The seller does not accept immediately. Of course they do not. A sword with $1 million appraisal does not get surrendered without a fight. They counter. The number they throw back is significantly higher than Rick's offer, higher than Rick will go, but positioned to signal that they are not giving this away, that they have leverage, that they know they have leverage. Rick shakes his head slowly. He repeats his core argument: risk, time, overhead, the specific challenge of finding the right buyer for something this specialized. He comes up slightly. The seller comes down slightly. Think about what is actually happening in this room. Two people are negotiating over a piece of history. A blade that may have been present at battles, at political intrigues, at moments that changed the shape of the world, is now the subject of a transaction in a pawn shop in Las Vegas, with cameras running and fluorescent lights overhead. There is something almost surreal about that. Something that Pawn Stars captures better than almost any other show. The collision of history's enormous sweep with the utterly mundane reality of commerce. The sword does not care what they are offering for it. It has survived centuries. It will survive this negotiation. But will a deal get done? Does Rick buy it? The cameras keep rolling. The numbers keep moving. And eventually, as they almost always do when both parties are serious and the object is genuine, they find a number somewhere in the middle. Rick Harrison buys the sword. The exact figure is significant, high enough to represent one of the largest single purchases in the show's history, low enough to give Rick the margin he needs to make the business case work. Both parties walk away knowing they gave something up. Both parties walk away knowing they got something real. But here is what makes this moment bigger than the transaction itself. When Rick takes possession of that sword, he is not just acquiring an inventory item. He is becoming the latest custodian of an object that has passed through dozens of hands over hundreds of years. Every person who ever owned that blade had their own story, their own reasons, their own moment of deciding that the sword's time with them was over. Rick Harrison is the latest chapter in a story that began centuries before he was born. He holds the sword one more time after the deal is done, turns it over in his hands, runs his thumb along the flat of the blade. looks at the engravings that someone spent hours etching into the metal in an era when this weapon represented the height of military technology. "This," Rick says to the camera, "is why I do this job." And you believe him completely. The broader world of million-dollar weapons. The sword on Pawn Stars is not an anomaly. It is an extreme example of a broader truth that collectors and investors have quietly understood for decades. Historic weapons are among the most consistently appreciating assets in the antiques market. The market for antique arms and militaria has grown steadily over the past 30 years, outperforming many traditional investment categories in specific niches. Weapons connected to documented historical figures or events carry what specialists call the provenance premium, an exponential multiplier applied to the base value of the object itself. That Napoleon saber sold for $6.5 million was purchased by an anonymous collector who understood that Napoleonic artifacts represent a finite, non-renewable resource. Napoleon is not making more swords. The supply is permanently fixed. And as long as there are wealthy collectors fascinated by the Napoleonic era, which will be essentially forever, demand continues to grow. The same logic applies to swords connected to medieval European history, to the Japanese samurai tradition, to the Ottoman Empire, to the American Civil War. Every historical period that commands serious scholarly and popular interest generates demand for authentic artifacts from that period. And swords, portable, durable, personal, and deeply symbolic, sit at the apex of that demand. A katana made by a master swordsmith of the Muromachi period can fetch hundreds of thousands of dollars. A Confederate officer's presentation sword from the Civil War, with documented provenance, regularly sells for six figures. A Crusader-era sword recovered from a European castle and authenticated by leading medieval historians would test the upper limits of what any collector has ever paid. The sword that walked into the gold and silver pawnshop sits in this tradition. It is not just a weapon, it is a physical artifact of human history. And history, it turns out, is extraordinarily expensive. What Pawn Stars teaches us about value. Here is something that 2 decades of Pawn Stars has demonstrated with remarkable consistency. Most people have no idea what their possessions are actually worth. Not because they are uninformed or careless, but because value, real, market-tested, historically grounded value, is a specialized field. The grandmother who keeps her father's military sword above the fireplace for 60 years is not thinking about auction estimates. She is thinking about her father. The collector who buys a blade at an estate sale for a few $100s is not running daily market comparisons. They are simply living with something they find beautiful. And then one day, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of curiosity, they walk into a pawn shop. Or they show up on a television program that has made the appraisal of extraordinary objects into one of the most compelling formats in the history of reality television. And they find out what they have. The $1 Million Sword is the extreme version of this story. But the principle scales all the way down. Every episode of Pawn Stars, at its core, is about the gap between what something is assumed to be worth and what it actually is. Sometimes the gap is disappointing. The item the seller thought was extraordinary turns out to be a reproduction worth $50. Sometimes it runs in the other direction, and a piece that seemed modest turns out to carry significance nobody had recognized. The lesson is deceptively simple. Know what you have. Before you sell, before you trade, before you walk into any negotiation, know what you have. Get it appraised. Do the research. Talk to experts. Because the difference between ignorance and knowledge in the world of antique weapons can be the difference between $100 and $1 million. Rick Harrison's legacy. It is worth stepping back to appreciate what Rick Harrison has actually built. The gold and silver pawn shop was never supposed to be famous. It was a family business in a gritty part of Las Vegas, built to serve the needs of local customers who needed quick cash and fair dealing. Rick grew up in that shop. He learned the trade from his father and from years of handling objects that spanned the full range of human creativity and human desperation. What turned it into a cultural institution was a combination of Rick's genuine expertise, his television charisma, and, most importantly, the extraordinary objects that kept appearing on his counter. Objects like the $1 Million sword. Pawn Stars has now run for more than 20 seasons. It has introduced millions of people to the world of antique collecting, historical artifacts, and the surprisingly complex economics of the secondary market. It has made Rick Harrison one of the most recognizable figures in American popular culture. But the show's real legacy is the way it democratized history. Week after week, for 20-plus years, Pawn Stars brought history off the walls of museums and out of the pages of textbooks and placed it on a glass counter in Nevada, where ordinary people could watch it being handled, examined, debated, and valued. A $1 Million sword is not just a television moment. It is a reminder that history is not abstract. It is physical. It is present. It is sitting in attics and storage units and estate sales all over the world, waiting for someone to look at it closely enough to understand what it actually is. Rick Harrison has been looking closely for 40 years, and every now and then, something looks back that takes even his breath away. The final question. So, here is what I want to leave you thinking about. Somewhere in the world right now, in a house you have driven past, in a family you might know, in an estate sale you might walk into next weekend, there is an object with a history that nobody around it fully understands. A sword, a coin, a letter, a painting, a piece of jewelry, something that has survived the centuries by being passed from hand to hand, each owner knowing only their own small piece of the larger story. Most of those objects will never end up on Pawn Stars. Most will never be appraised by experts or sold for life-changing sums. They will continue to sit on mantelpieces and in cardboard boxes, their stories untold, their value unrecognized. But some of them, the lucky ones, get their story told, get held up to the light, get the attention they deserve after centuries of waiting. The $1 Million sword that walked into the gold and silver pawn shop was one of those lucky objects. And the fact that it ended up in Rick Harrison's hands, a man who understood exactly what he was holding, is the kind of happy accident that makes history feel, just for a moment, like it has a sense of justice. Now I want to hear from you. What is the most valuable thing you have ever discovered in a family home, an estate sale, or an antique shop? Have you ever had something appraised and been shocked by the result? In either direction? Drop it in the comments below. Because if this story has taught us anything, it is that extraordinary history has a habit of hiding in the most ordinary places. And if you want more stories like this one, the biggest deals, the most shocking appraisals, the moments that stopped Rick Harrison in his tracks, make sure you subscribe, because the gold and silver pawn shop never closes, and the next $1 million moment could walk through that door anytime.